It's a pleasure to be here and to participate in the Shiff lecture series at the Center for Jewish Studies, where I have many friends. And I've listened to several lectures in the past from this series, including, I think it was the last one, Shaul Magid's lecture on the Satmar Rebbe, which was really extraordinary. I do admit that the topic today is pretty sensitive, but you know, if we would do only easy topics, we would betray our mandate. And my last introduction is that this is part of a continuing project that I'm conducting with Professor Adi Ophir from Brown University. And it's a project that we've started already in 2006 and hopefully will come to fruition very soon in Oxford University Press. Okay. Much scholarship has been devoted to Jewish relations with Gentiles in different periods in both halachic and Agadic context. Scholars discuss the boundaries between Jews and Gentiles, their creation and stability, and especially the ability to move from one side of the boundary to the other. My focus is different. Instead of the Jewish relationship with the Gentile or the boundaries between them, I wish to explore the category of the Gentile, the Goy itself. This concept divides reality in its entirety in a binary manner, Jews and non-Jews. The latter are lumped together into one group. Such partition and naming is anything but self-evident, and was not always a part of the thought patterns of Jews and Judaism. In fact, I would argue that the universal Goy, which includes any Gentile in the world, first appears in rabbinic literature in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. This change and its thorough implications did not gain any scholarly attention. The persistent presence of the concept from rabbinic literature until, well, the present, has made it almost invisible to scholarship, which took this presence for granted. This oversight is noteworthy, especially due to the vast recent interest in the birth and development of the opposite concept, Yehudi or Judaios, by many scholars. In what follows, I shall present a short description of the birth of the Goy, and point out some repercussions this category's crystallization had in and on rabbinic literature. Now, due to time constraints, I will not read all the sources, but will count on your multitasking abilities. Okay, let's begin. As is well known in the Bible as in Second Temple literature, Goy means nothing more than nation. And Israel too is a Goy, a nation among the nations, Goy Kadosh, if you will. Goy is a reference to a single person who is not Jewish, is not documented at all before rabbinic literature. The term used for that is nochri, stranger. The nochri appears often in the Bible in a general sense of strangeness. In biblical legislation, however, nochri denotes a group and refers specifically to those who are not of Israel. The nochri is especially popular in the book of Deuteronomy, and specifically in Deuteronomistic legislation, where for the first time it is contrasted with the Israelite or your brother. See, for example, source number 1 in your handouts. This is connected to another Deuteronomistic novelty, the concept of a holy people, Am Kadosh, unique to this book. These new concepts together made the priestly code's equality of ger, alien resident, and ezrach, native born, impossible anymore, pushing the ger to the realm of the nochri. The ger can eat a carrion, nevela, like a nochri. This is source number 2, in stark contrast to the priestly legislation, as both the ger and the nochri are defined here meaning in Deuteronomy, negatively. They're not brothers of the Israelites. And so, the holy nation and the nochri were born together in Deuteronomy as both sides of the same idea of election. The Deuteronomistic nochri is thus the forefather of the rabbinic Goy. In both, it is a generalization which received its meaning from its place as an opposition to the chosen people. However, two significant elements in the future Goy are still missing from the Deuteronomistic Nochri. First, the Nochri does not have as yet the independent traits of the rabbinic Goy. The opposing term, Am Kadosh, has no inherent traits in Deuteronomy either. It is presented as an expression of arbitrary election, which is a product of God's inexplicable love, ahava or cheshek. Second, and more importantly for our purpose, Deuteronomy does not have a total binary division under which every person in the world is classified. There are more categories than these two, Israel or Nochri. The ger, again, the alien resident, is a good example for the inconclusiveness of the Deuteronomistic division. The ger is opposed to your brother and is not covered by prohibition which are incumbent on the holy people. But nonetheless, the ger is your ger, gercha. And unlike the Nochri, is part of the covenant community, as is explicit in the covenant renewal rituals in Deuteronomy 29, Atem Nitzavim, this is source number 3, as well as Deuteronomy 31, Hakel. The ger is indeed marginalized in Deuteronomy, but is not written out of the story. Together with the other needy and landless, the ger must be cared for, and may come on pilgrimage on the temple. Group distinctions are strong in Deuteronomy, but they are not binary, neither binary nor total. This could be clearly demonstrated by the fact that the Nochri, mentioned only 5 times in Deuteronomy, does not erase their various distinctions between different nations, such as the people of Canaan, the Moabite, the Edomite, the Egyptians. Each deserve a different attitude in the Deuteronomistic legislation, and a good example is Deuteronomy 23, which appear in source 4 in your handout, where different peoples deserve different attitude. Almost nothing of that will remain of rabbinic literature, which, adopting the historical postulate that Sancheriv mixed the nation, bilbel et ha'umot, treat them all as one, effectively erasing all differences between nations. In other words, in the Deuteronomistic story, the election of the holy people does not define as yet all those who are not chosen. Only with the birth of the Goy, all those who are not Jews will receive one unified negative name. As noted above, the in-between status of the ger was formed in Deuteronomy as a reconciliation of two forces, or vectors, the ethnic and the social. It was a way to combine the logic of separation with the ethic of care, right? He's a ger, so he's not your brother, but he's your ger, so he's part of the covenant community. The Tanaitic Midrash Sifrei on Deuteronomy also acknowledges these two forces, but completely subjugate the social to the ethnic. And this is source number 5. The Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, as well as the resident alien, the ger, and orphans, and the widows in your towns. Now, look at the Midrash. Just as the Levite is of the covenant, ben Brit, meaning a Jew, so too all those are of the covenant. Now, just as the poor is in need, chaser, so too all those are in need, right? Although the decisive parameter is still neediness, it is subjected to the ethnic logic. Anyone on the list must be of the covenant, and therefore the scriptural ger, the alien resident, must become a convert, ger shenitgayer, in rabbinic literature. The creation of the rabbinic binary model entails, therefore, a systematic erasure of the middle ground between the groups. In rabbinic literature, the biblical ger becomes one who converted, ger shenitgayer, and the resident ger, the biblical ger, is marginalized until the Talmuds can compare him to a goy in every respect, lechol dvarav. Together with the crystallization of the goy, the demarcation between Jews and Gentiles become clearer, as do the rules for crossing borderlines. Diffusion is supplanted by a sharp and distinct border. There is no longer a room for a middle ground, and the transformation from Jew to Gentile must be institutionalized. This is the meaning of the appearance of the conversion ceremony in rabbinic literature. Not the conversion, but the conversion ceremony, which is first attested, in its entirety in rabbinic literature, in the Baraita, in Bavli Tractate Yevamot, as an agent of immediate transformation. And I quote, "A convert who immersed and rose from the pool is an Israelite in all regards. The biblical ger is a disruption in the binary system, and so the rabbis must cancel this status. Either a person converts and is a Jew or remains a Gentile in every respect." Another example of the erasing of intermediate categories is the status of the Samaritans, Kutim. The Mishnah discussed the Samaritan as a doubtful Jew and cast it beside Shtuki and a Sufi who do not know who the fathers were. This is source number 6, Mishnah Kiddushin. Engaging with the Kuti as a doubt and discussing it in the context of 10 types of lineage, Asara Yochasim, allows the Mishnah to integrate the Samaritans into the binary opposition, Jew-Gentile, an opposition which allows for doubtful cases, but not for intermediate categories. In the longer version of this paper, I discuss additional intermediate categories, such as the Noachites, apostate, Meshumadim, foreign slaves, Eved Knaani, claiming that the rabbis made a consistent effort with varying degrees of success to integrate them into the binary system. But this is the shorter version, so you're exempt. This effort to eliminate the middle ground indicates that something new occurs here. Not just a linguistic shift from biblical to rabbinic Hebrew, but a different discourse. This is exactly the missing piece in the scholarly discussions of the rabbinic Goy. Previous studies of the status of Gentiles in rabbinic literature did not link this status, as far as I can tell, to the birth of the concept itself. As a result, the causes and implications of this change remained uncovered. For the real novelty is not a new treatment of Gentiles, but the very fact that they are Gentiles, Goyim, a category which served to divide humanity in an unprecedented manner. As is well known, the concept of the Yehudi, denoting a people, not a tribe, Judah, or region, Judea, was formed during the beginning of the Second Temple. But at that time, the Yehudi was not cast in opposition to the Goy. Although in the literature of the time we can discern that Yehudi is conceived indeed as an ethnic marker, it is contrasted with plurality, not uniformity. Thus in Esther, for example, the book of Esther, Mordechai HaYehudi is faced not with a uniform Gentile, but with Haman the Agagite, with every nation, their enemies, etc. The same holds true for Ezra's separation from the people of the land. This is source number 7. As well as for Nehemiah, Zechariah, and other late biblical texts. A clear example of the transformation taking place in rabbinic literature vis-a-vis early Second Temple sources can be found in the blessing "Who has not made me a Gentile," first attested in Tosefta Brachot 6:18. This is source number 8. This is the very ending of the Tractate Brachot in the Tosefta. And thus we read, Rabbi Yehuda says a man should say 3 blessings every day. Blessed is he who has not made me a Gentile. Blessed is he who has not made me an ignorant, bur. Blessed is he who has not made me a woman. For a Gentile, for it says, all Gentiles, Goyim, are nothing to him. As not and vanity they count towards him. An ignorant, for there is no ignorant fearful of sin. A woman, for women are not obligated in the commandment. Now, the Tosefta seems to be laying down 3 distinctions which define the Jewish sage, termed here simply Adam, person, or man. But while the distinction between the Jewish sage and women or ignorance merits an explanation in the Tosefta, the distinction between him and the Gentiles is justified by using a verse which presents Gentiles simply as not, ein, ephes, tohu. In its biblical context, at the beginning of Isaiah 40, or what we call second Isaiah, the verse describes the smallness of all nations in face of the Lord of the universe. Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket and are counted as a small dust of the scales. In the benediction of Rabbi Yehuda, however, Goyim nations become Goyim Gentiles. And thus the biblical distinction between creator and creatures, all creatures, becomes a distinction no less sharp between Jews and all others. While the Tosefta requires a concrete explanation regarding the division between sages and non-sages, or men and women. In the case of the Gentiles, a verse which clarifies their ontological status is sufficient. Now, fourth Ezra, or Chazon Ezra, a Hebrew apocalyptic, Hebrew originally, the Hebrew is now lost, a Hebrew apocalyptic composition from around 100 CE, also shared this tradition, which cites the very same verse, and this is source number 1. The fourth Ezra was only preserved in the Syriac translation and a Latin translation from the Greek, so the Syriac and the English is in front of you. For the other nations which have descended from Adam, you have said that they're nothing, and that they are like spittle. And you have compared their abundance to a drop of a bucket. And now, O Lord, these nations, which are reputed as nothing, domineer over us and devour. In both for Ezra and the Tosefta, the term goyim in the verses is taken to mean foreigners rather than nations. But the difference between Fourth Ezra and the Tosefta is no less apparent. While in Fourth Ezra the context remains exclusively political, foreign nations versus Israel, in the Tosefta it is individualized to form a distinction between Jews and Gentiles, individual Jews and Gentiles. At this point, the basic difference between the rabbinic Goy and the Helleno-Roman barbarian, another category containing all others, comes to light. Schopenhauer, no other than Schopenhauer, was the first to compare these benedictions of identity, with which he knew from the Jewish liturgy, rather than from the sources, with the testimony of Diogenes Laertius that, and I quote, Socrates would thank his gods every day for making him human and not a beast, a man and not a woman, a Greek and not a barbarian. But, end of quote. But our Tosefta is not content with this distinction on a social level, adding a theological justification for all Gentiles are nothing to him. Indeed, the idea of divine election as the basis of the distinction marks a conceptual difference between the Goy and the barbarian. Although a Greek or Roman may have used the latter term to mark superiority on linguistic, cultural, and even physical level, it was not used with a metaphysical connotation of divine election. Obviously, rabbinic literature is but an end of a long process, echoes of which can be heard in various Second Temple texts, but which the terminological shift itself is not capable of uncovering. However, I believe that the terminological transformation exposes a significant stage in the maturity of this separation, so significant, in fact, that it may be considered as the beginning of a new discourse. True, it was possible to separate yourself from Gentiles, even extremely so, even before the existence of a uniform category for all Gentiles. But it is a different kind of separation. The most extreme example is the Book of Jubilees, from somewhere in the 2nd century BCE this time, presenting a severe separation, but always from the nations in plural. And this is source number 10 in your handout. These verses present an ideology of a complete and total separation of the children of Jacob from the nations, but they still do not have the category to include all Gentiles. The verses therefore hop between two different categories, idolaters and Canaanite. This is not a difference in naming alone. The very general term Goy includes in it the justifications for the separation, for it is by definition a negative term, defining the very otherness of the others, and so requires no further justification. This is well exemplified in the rabbinic expression, and I've not cited it in the handout, unfortunately, mipnei goyut goyim, which should be translated somewhat like due to the Gentileness or gentility of Gentiles. Mipnei goyut goyim, which is cited in Sifrei Numbers in order to explain why the Israelites should purify themselves after the battle with Midian at the end of the book of Numbers. As was shown by my colleague Vered Noam in her book on corpse impurity, the sentence is deliberately tautological. As if, right, mipnei goyut goim, as if saying, do not look for external reasons for the impurity of things that were touched by goyim. It is the gentility itself that is the cause. No additional explanation is needed. In Jubilees, in contrast, separation is accompanied constantly by detailed, specific justification. They offer sacrifices to the dead, through Ham's sin Canaan aired. There is no hope for all those who worship idols, etc. Indeed, the repetitive, almost pedantic obsession with the need for difference in Jubilees may indicate the very real lack of categorization in a world where distinction is still a constant struggle and the boundary is not clear-cut. In the rabbinic world, the border is clear and the distinction self-evident. Thus, for example, and quite surprisingly, apart from one cryptic ruling in Mishnah Sanhedrin 9:5, Haboel Aramit Kanaim Pog'im bo, Tannaitic literature does not contain any explicit prohibition on intermarriage. The legal activity focuses on the interface between Jew and Gentile without questioning the stability of the categories themselves. The lack of a general category in Jubilees is also made evident by the frequent ethnic discussions which categorizes different peoples that appear along the book of Jubilees. Canaanite, Esav, Ishmael, Arameans, right? So the sons of Jacob are not allowed to marry the daughters of Ishmael, but are allowed to marry the daughters of Lavan, etc. A similar example may be found in the animal apocalypse, a 2nd century BCE apocalyptic allegory embedded now in the first book of Enoch, and this is source number 11. Chapter 89 narrates, in First Enoch, narrates the division of nations based on the similar description in Genesis chapter 10. But unlike its biblical source, the apocalypse, the animal apocalypse, portray this process in stark negative terms. The nations appear as unclean beasts. The only exception is Abraham, presented as a white bull. The vision is decoded by Dvorah Dimant thus, and I quote, "The cattle signifies Israel, while the wild animals and predator beards are Gentiles. The distinction between Israel and the Gentiles is presented as fundamental, a constant battle, and is a central axis in the apocalypse as a whole," end of quote. Note, however, that it is exactly this binary representation, Israel versus Gentiles, that is missing from the apocalypse. The nations are different from each other, and each has its own characteristic. Ishmael is a wild ass, Esav is a swine, Egypt wolves, Philistine dogs, etc. This is not a minor difference. The lack of binary structure allows the apocalypse to present a narrative of separation which transcends the Israel nation division. It speaks in the rise of a small group of young sheep, most probably the Essenes, who create the new elect group from which the universal eschatological redemption begins. Here again, the lack of total binary distinction allows for both the shrinking of the elected group and for expanding it potentially universally. This type of ethnic stereotype is hardly present in rabbinic literature. While some stereotypes may still be found there, both general Greek or Roman ones and others born out of midrashic manipulation, they are perceived there as but specification of one basic unity. This is why stereotypes can be transferred from one nation to the other quite easily. Thus, for example, we read in Mechilta de Arayot, this is source number 12. The Mechilta de Arayot is embedded in the Sifra, in the Midrash on the book of Leviticus. Scripture, HaKatuv, teaches that the deeds of the Canaanite were most corrupt, mekulkalim, of all people. And then details. They were overrun with idolatry and incest and bloodshed and meleers and bestializers. Now, this may seem as a specific ethnic stereotype directed specifically toward the Canaanite, but right away the whole list is transferred also to the Egyptians, mentioned in the same verse. Scripture compared Hikish, the deed of Egypt, to that of the Canaanite. Just as the deed of the Canaanites are awash with idolatry, etc., so also the deeds of the Egyptians. Yet another example is cited in source number 13, where the Mechilta bases its interpretation of the verse on the well-known stereotype of the Egyptians as magicians. Let's read it. It's actually pretty cool. Source number 13. The Egyptians pursued after them, teaching that none of them, meaning none of the Egyptians, has stumbled on the way, so that they could not practice magic, Shema Yenachashu, meaning see it, the stumbling, as a divine sign, and turn back to Egypt. And thus we find everywhere, meaning everywhere in the Bible, that the Gentiles, Hagoyim, practice augury. For it is written, those nations that are about to dispose do indeed resort to soothsayers and augurs. The elders of Moab and the elders of Midian set out with divinations in their powers. And Bilam, the son of Beor, the augur, Hakosem. Now, before we can even start speculating about the rabbinic conceptualization of Egypt or Egyptians as magicians, the homily adds, and thus we find everywhere, and then cites verses about what? Canaanites, Moabites, and Midianites, but not Egyptians. Goyim are Goyim. Now, in various Second Temple texts, most clearly in the Dead Sea Scroll, the biblical term Goyim, nations, was used specifically to denote foreign nations. A similar move can be detected in the Septuagint and the New Testament probably after it, where ethne came to denote foreign nations specifically. That's why there is no laoi in the Septuagint, only laos for Israel and ethne for the nations. In the Pauline corpus, another process no less important may be detected. Paul uses the term ethne in a new, I would say, apolitical context. The biblical call to the nations is reinterpreted by Paul as turning to individuals or communities among the nations who choose to join the community of believers in Christ. This is in stark contrast not only to the Septuagint heritage, but also to Hebrew compositions such as 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, in which Israel and the nations are opposed. In Israel as a nation is opposed to all other nations, Goyim, but this division remains in the political sphere alone, while in the individual context, the eschatological sentence is consistently narrated as universal. Now, these two processes, in which Goy becomes a specific term for foreigners, as in Qumran and the Septuagint, meaning generalization of the concept, and is applied to individual rather than nations, meaning individuation of the concept, may be found sporadically in pre-rabbinic literature. The combination of these two displacements, the generalization and the individuation, marks the birth of the Goy as we know it. As far as I can tell, the two displacements did not converge in pre-rabbinic literature. Yet, the privatization or individuation of the Septuagint ethne in Paul's letters, using them to mark individual rather than political entities, demands further attention. For it is this move that brings Paul closer than any other pre-rabbinic Jewish text to the Tanaitic early rabbinic binary system of Jew versus Goy. Paul uses such dichotomy several times, mainly in Romans and Galatians. Scholars universally, as much as I can tell, assume that such division is a common Jewish heritage, ascribing to Paul only its annulment. Thus, even when Christer Stendhal calls in his revolutionary essay, Paul Among Jews and Gentiles, for a radical rereading of Paul's letters in the context of the relations between Jews and Gentiles, and laments, and I quote, the lost centrality of Jews and Gentiles in Western scholarship, which later became the new perspective in Pauline research, Stendhal still treats the division itself as evident. And the very first sentence in this essay is, as a Jew, he, meaning Paul, had grown accustomed to dividing humankind into those two parts, ends of quote. But if we question the ancient Jewish heritage assumption, as I'm offering to do, a new, quite exciting actually, possibility appears. Namely that Paul is in fact involved in the creation of the binary division he is working so hard to dismantle. This may be, in fact, less strange than it seems. The apostle to the Gentiles is forced, maybe for the first time, to conceptualize the Gentiles. Our difficulty to accept this comes from the fact that we tend not to distinguish between attitude toward Gentiles and the very conceptualization of the Gentile. We thus assume that forging the Gentile inevitably leads to exclusion. But for Paul, it is exactly the combat for inclusion that leads him to reform and privatize the biblical ethne. This, however, deserved a much fuller study that cannot be completed here, and I've published an article called Paul and the Invention of Gentiles, which deserve a lot of, let's say, lively debate and pushback, but that's a different discussion. For our context, suffice it to note that Paul's Gentile, whatever its sources are, is not yet the rabbinic one, far from it. Paul struggles to establish the opposition Jew-Gentile and cannot take it for granted. Jews and Gentiles do not appear as a standard pair for him. The natural pair is Jew versus Greek, which, as scholars claimed, is modeled after the Hellenistic Greco-barbarian opposition, as is apparent in the opening of Romans, and this is source number 14. The Jew-Greek division became both redundant and incomprehensive when the more general division, Jew-Gentile, was established in rabbinic or institutionalized in rabbinic literature. This category shift into a system which is wholly binary can be demonstrated by comparing the rabbinic attitude to the Gentiles' sexual ethics with pre-rabbinic attitudes to this same topic. Various Second Temple texts mark the distinction between Jews and all other nations by the sexual self-restraints of the formers. For example, in the letter of Aristeas, or pseudo-Aristeas, and this is source number 14, the food laws are justified as a symbol that, and I quote, "we are separated from all men, for most other men defile themselves in their sex, and in this they shall sin greatly, and lands and countries all take pride in it. And not only do they sleep with men, they also defile the mothers and the daughters. But we are separated from this." But even here, the nations are not a name for a unified entity, but rather indicate a plurality. The difference from later discourse is well apparent from a comparison of this theme to a homily in the Sifra, and this is source number 16, which also uses the biblical distinction between kosher and non-kosher animals to think about the distinction between Israel and the nation. And it seems that both Pseudo-Aristeas 152 and the Sifra's homilies are basically reading the same verses in Leviticus 20, which juxtapose the "you shall separate between pure and impure animals," and "I have separated you from the nations," and thus they read them together and use the kosher and non-kosher animals to speak about distinction from the nations. So this is a shared tradition, but I want to emphasize the different manner that these two texts use this tradition. Now the Sifra says, "See how you're different from the nations. In the nations, a man decorates his wife and gives her to another. A man decorates himself and gives himself to another." Now, while in Aristeas one nation is distinguished from the many, in the Sifra there are already two unified entities juxtaposed to each other. The nations do this, while Israel do that. Aristeas features realistic reasons for the accusation. This is what most Pleonist people do. Cities and lands all, holai, take pride in it, not offering any essentialist characteristic of the nations as a whole. The Sifra, in contrast, features the nation as a proper name, which requires no detail or recognition of plurality, and so has no need to apologize or simply account for the all-comprehensiveness of the accusation, as in Aristeas. This results in a basic difference in the discourse of separation itself. Not the gentility of the Gentiles is the reason for separation in Aristeas, but specific cultural issues. Note that in verse 152, the last verse, the same verb, diastello, is used to denote both separation from forbidden sexual practices and from all men. And I've marked it. The latter being a product of the former. In contrast, the homily in the Sifra portrays separation itself as a basis of identity and chosenness. And I will separate you from the nations for me. If you are separate from the nations, you are to be mine, or literally to my name, lishmi. And if not, you shall belong to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and his friends. So note that just as Israel has one king, right, God, so the nations have one king, Nebuchadnezzar, right? So the lack of binary dichotomy in Second Temple literature is apparent not only in blurring the distinction towards the outside, right, ger, noachides, differentiation between various people, but also toward the inside, dividing the Jewish people to various groups with different ontological status. Thus, Aaron Shemesh Zal has shown that the same laws and midrashic techniques which function in rabbinic literature to separate between Jews and Gentiles function in the Dead Sea Scroll to separate between the members of the Yachad, the sect, and anyone else. Thus, in the Dead Sea Scroll, we find a systematic reading of the biblical terms your fellow, your brother, reacha, achicha, etc., which the rabbis interpret as referring to your fellow Jew as marking the members of the Yachad only. In the same vein, scholars have claimed that the laws of circumcision in Jubilees 15, this is source 17 in your handout, are meant not only to distinction between Jews and other nations, but also between those who keep the sectarian laws and all other Jewish groups. This should be contrasted with the Mishnah in Tractate Nedarim, source number 18, which categorically rules that only Goyim are called uncircumcised, Arelim. And it seems to me that the Mishnah is actually polemical and means all Israels are considered circumcised even if physically they're uncircumcised. Scholars have dealt with these issues in the context of the sectarian consciousness, but I wish to emphasize something different. These internal separations are only possible before the maturity of the binary dichotomy, after which all internal differences between Jewish groups as well as between various nations are subjected to the one single distinction between Jew and Gentile. This is nowhere clearer than in the Mishnah on the 10 types of lineage, Asara Yochasim, and this is again source number 6 above. My claim is thus that the famous rabbinic inclusive tendency toward different group discussed and celebrated so extensively in scholarship, for example in Shaya Cohen's The Significance of Yavne, should be also read in the context of the birth of the dichotomy Jew-Goy. One who is not a Goy is a Jew, even if an unlawful or criminal Jew. In other words, the exclusivity of the rabbinic discourse towards the Gentiles and the inclusiveness toward Jews are two sides of the very same coin, the coin of the birth of the dichotomy. The gradation offered in Mishnah Kiddushin on 10 type of lineage, Asara Yochasin, may teach us something else. One cannot, to my mind, explain the birth of the Goy solely on the ground of the rabbinic tendency towards systematization and formalization. Strong in this tendency in the rabbinic law is, it should not necessarily lead to a binary distinction. Rather, it could have brought to a sequence of distinctions, a gradation, in the manner of the biblical distinction between various nations and the rabbinic gradation between different types of lineage regarding Jews. The change of perspective suggested above demand to rethink several scholarly assumptions. It mainly casts some doubt on the prevalent view in which the rabbis are most generally placed in or near the inclusive end of the spectrum. Now, my goal here is not to take issue with previous studies from which I've learned immensely, but to kind of flesh out the change of perspective. So let me exemplify this with Christine Hayes' 2002 Gentile Impurities and Jewish Identities. The major thesis of this extremely erudite study is that the rabbis have rejected the genealogical model of Ezra, which was prevalent in several Second Temple compositions such as Jubilees and 4Q MMT, Miktzat Maaseh Torah. The rejection of Ezra's Holy Seed model is apparent per haze in several different areas, such as the prohibition on intermarriage, which the rabbis considered to be only a decree, and the possibility of conversion, which does not exist at all in Ezra and Jubilees, and probably not, also not in Qumran. Without contesting here the details of Hay's study, I would like to offer a different, indeed quite opposite evaluation of them. Indeed, genealogical concerns are not as central to rabbinic literature as they are to Ezra or Jubilees, but this does not attest to more openness on behalf of the rabbis. Quite to the contrary, the discourse of genealogy belongs to a world in which there is no concept of goyim, and the Jewish identity is an extension of a familiar or tribal identity. The Goy has no unified genealogy, and when the Jew becomes its counterpart, it is reshaped to match. The new binary system replaces the genealogical dimension and makes it superfluous. From this perspective, conversion too becomes something else. Hayes cites conversion as a proof that the rabbis veered away from the genealogical tradition in which individuals cannot join the Jewish people, much as an Israelite cannot become a priest. But in fact, the rabbis did not allow conversion. Rather, they invented it. They transformed diffusive spaces of transformation and adaptation into a sharp and unequivocal procedure of conversion. Instead of reading this procedure as evidence of a permeable border between groups, it should be seen, to my mind, as the very erection of this border, a border which includes in it well-kept and organized crossings. Noahide laws also looks differently from this perspective. They were read by important scholars, among them Professor David Novak, as a universal moral standard from all peoples, a kind of Jewish jus gentium. My reading is different. Several Second Temple works contain lists of commandments to Noah's sons. All of them are universalistic, aimed at humanity at large, and we can find them in the book of Jubilees, chapter 10, and in Acts, chapter 15, and at the beginning of the Damascus covenant, and maybe there's additional hint. They were gathered and discussed by many scholars. Tanaitic literature is the first source in which these commandments are fully segregated. The legal discussion at the end of Tosefta Avodah Zarah forces the Noahide commandment into a binary division between Israel and the nations, thus equating in an unprecedented manner the sons of Noah with Gentiles. In fact, this is the whole, and this is the first time actually that the son of Noah becomes Gentiles. In fact, this is the whole logic of the Tosefta discussion, as David Sabato showed in a brilliant MA thesis on this chapter in the Tosefta. It is a collection of different sources based on one shared theme, the distinction between Jews and Gentiles. This is also why the term Noahide and Gentiles are interchangeable in this Tosefta, as you can see in source number 19. And again, I've marked the movement from one turn to the other. To this, I would connect another important halachic phenomenon, the limitation of the biblical brotherhood, achva, to Jews only. As Adiel Schremer correctly pointed, although brother and a member of the same nation is common in both biblical and post-biblical literature, the Tanaim were the first to transform this idea into a general and systematic hermeneutic principle, applied each and every time that achicha or reacha appear in the Pentateuch. However, Schremer noted few Amoraic narratives in which the idea of universal brotherhood does exist. Following Moshe David Herr, he thus claimed that the concept of universal brotherhood is a Roman influence, and its rather late appearance only in Amoraic sources demonstrate that, and I quote, "The Jews of Roman Palestine took a while to internalize the Roman cultural position that all humans are as brothers," end of quote. However, similar claims appear in Josephus and others And there's no reason to believe that they infiltrated Palestine only at the Tannaitic period. Moreover, this idea need not have been introduced by the Romans at all, as it is featured many times in biblical and post-biblical prophetic and wisdom literature. See, for example, Ben Sira in source 20, and there's many such statements that I could cite. I would therefore like to suggest the exact opposite. The idea of universal humanity did not appear in Amorite literature due to Roman influence, but rather disappeared from Tannaitic literature despite its presence in previous Jewish works. I would also like to at least posit that the birth of the Goy is linked somehow to the loss of those ideas of universal brotherhood. Now, instead of summary, I wish to say a few words about the use of the term discourse in this study. What I'm looking for is not ideology per se, but a specific combination of ideas, techniques, and institutions, a combination which the Foucauldian neologism covers perfectly. Along with the new naming comes a set of practices and institutions of which the ritual of conversion is but the most apparent. Furthermore, the birth of the Goy may be seen as a discovery of a new technology, no less and maybe more than an ideological shift. The Book of Jubilees, for example, espouses a very strong separatist ideology. What it lacks is the technology that would allow it to establish a binary dichotomy. And thus, it must list each time anew all those specific groups to him the seed of Jacob, from whom the seed of Jacob must be separated. Canaanite idolaters, Esav, Ishmael, etc. As in any new discourse, many of the elements were already in existence before its birth. Much of the rabbinic Goy existed in the biblical Nochri, Etne, or Ger, just like many of the elements which were eventually combined into the modern prison existed already in the monasteries, madhouses, or military camps. And yet the specific amalgam of these elements, the ethnic mindset, together with the metaphysical overtones and the dichotomy which it entails, is indeed novel. I would like to re-emphasize that I do not claim that in the real world of late antiquity there was an actual binary division between Jews and Gentiles, that there were no intermediate categories, and that a clear definition of every person as a Jew or a Gentile was possible. What I am claiming instead is that these are the concepts which the rabbi wished to force upon the world. The measure of success which the rabbis encounters in their attempt to shape the world in their own image has been discussed by various historians and is still an open question. Suffice it to say that there is no doubt that the new rabbinic conceptualization was indeed translated into practices which were very real, such as the conversion ceremony and specific impurity laws. Before ending, one last marginal point should be discussed: history. I have avoided up to now explicit historical or sociological explanations to the birth of the Goy. Several directions were hinted in the course of the analysis. First and foremost, the destruction of the temple, which brought about the loss of political boundaries and therefore the need to establish alternative discursive borders. Rabbinic conceptualization of the Goy may thus seem as another case of a map replacing territory. Further, the Tannaitic move may be compared to that of the Babylonian exiles and later returnees in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Second, in the course of the paper, few polemical contexts were mentioned or hinted, both with regard to Hellenistic Judaism and nascent Christianity and to Qumran and sectarianism. One could offer further context, and each of these should be evaluated independently. This was not my goal here. Rather, I have attempted to mark and to establish the very existence of the phenomenon before entering to historical speculation regarding the reasons for its appearance. One should bear in mind that whatever historical explanation we would offer, the discourse of the Goy persisted way beyond the specific historical moment discussed here, not leaving us in fact to this very day. But, and this is the last but, this does not mean that we are doomed to live with this binary system. The Goy is indeed an extremely stable concept in Jewish history, but it was not always there. Other discourses existed before the rabbinic one, in which there was a Yehudi but not a Goy, and thus the former was part of a plurality of identities instead of a component in a total binary system. Historicizing is by definition de-essentializing. If the Goy was born at a specific historical moment, it could also die, giving way to other discursive forms. What would they be? How would the Jew look like without the Goy as its counterpart, its mirror image? These are already questions of political imagination, and thus a good point for a philological study like this one to end.